Welcome again, my fellow gaming enthusiasts, to the Fatman GM's revisitation of a 1979-1980 circa game system called Space Opera, produced by FGU, or Fantasy Games Unlimited. Typical of most RPGs, they have a equipment, what they call a ground and air equipment guide. And this particular one actually is probably the only supplement to the core books that include rules. Like I said, the designers that created the core book tried to make sure that the two core books had everything you needed, but this expands for operating into more detailed rules for operating small craft, vehicle combat, starfighter combat, that kind of stuff. The game, or the book itself, is typical of the FGU space opera line. It's not graphically heavy. There's not a lot of pictures. What's there is kind of basic or simple, just to give you a little bit of flavor. They didn't have the resources or the artwork or the artists necessary to create a lot of that stuff, I'm guessing. Also, another thing it lacks is what we consider background story or storyline material or traditional fluff. They don't go into great elaborate descriptions on the equipment. A lot of it's pretty basic, boils down to the stats and what we need to operate these things. We have the breakdown for the vehicles. They compartmentalize them, so these are armored vehicles here. There's value in simplicity of this type of layout, in my opinion. It's not necessary to have an individual paragraph for every class of a type of vehicle, and it's not really practical. In that case, a tank is a tank is a tank. It doesn't matter if it's a light, medium. What more important is what era is it from, what's its tech level, what's it capable of. It's up to us to fill in the blanks, to create backstory for it if necessary, to give it artwork if necessary. If you need something for reference. But like I said, so you can see that the majority of the stats and mechanics are straightforward for simplicity purposes. Ready to grab, ready to pull out of here. Utilize what you need. Then we get into sections on EW, ECM equipment, anti-aircraft fire, the rules for using them, anti-aircraft missiles, aircraft rules, type of aircraft, basic rules on how to conduct flight operations and combat in flight. Air and starfighter combat, air crashes due to breakdown, mechanical failure, bombing and strafing, planetary bombardment. Just a slight note on the due to breakdown pilot error. Because the space opera has several tech classes, if you will, for player characters, they include quite a bit of rules on things like general maintenance and what happens to stuff when you don't maintain them or don't maintain them properly. And that is to add flavor and drama to a adventure or a campaign. So if your pilot is in a desperate dogfight and starts having mechanical failures because the unit's technician had been assassinated or killed or went on leave or whatever the previous game turn, he might be in a bad spot. So there's potential drama and or play just for that purpose or that reason. Now, a lot of game systems, science fiction game systems, include those, but they gloss over it. They don't see the need for having the elaborate sets of rules for that. But that's because even though they have technicians as a class, it's considered and they touch it in the core book too when they talk about how to apply certain things of that nature. You have a mechanic present or access to a mechanic, and his skill set's significantly high enough, unless the game master requires a dramatic pause or thing to occur. There's no reason to have that player making a bunch of unnecessary rolls to see if they fix something or unfix something or hack into something. If they have the ability to do it, then they just do it. just to give it time, figure out how long it takes them, and whether that's going to affect the dramatic situation of the ongoing encounter. So, we got military aircraft, weapons, dogfighting, ceilings, range, typical stuff you'd expect to find. And we get into the breakdown of the stats for aircraft, spacecraft. We got air-to-surface missiles, starfighters, stats for the starfighters. Now, I've had some people over the years, both playing this back in the day and in more modern sci-fi game systems, and they get confused when they see the source books or equipment stats for lower tech stuff. Why would anybody have atmospheric fighters in a modern era when they got starfighters, when starfighters can do everything? Well, my argument is cost and purpose. There's a lot of reasons why a planetary government or a corporation or a really wealthy individual might choose to protect it, wanting to protect his turf or her turf, would forego the more expensive flight operations required for starfighters and have a bunch of jets sitting around. The other possibility is, especially in games like this, where the tech level of the planets you go and encounter are wide and varied. It's not impossible to find planets that are the Stone Age, that you're going to interact with people in the Bronze Era and the Middle Ages and the Atomic Era and so on and so forth. So thus, they're going to have technology in those brackets. Plus, like I said, if you're a large government and you've got to pay for your military, sometimes it's much cheaper to have task-oriented stuff. So if I'm not concerned about what's going on beyond an atmosphere, having fighters or starfighters is kind of an extra expense. And there's the addition that it's a given that atmospheric fighters are goal-specific for the atmosphere of the planets they operate in, which means they're probably better at that and faster and more maneuverable than the equivalent starfighter, which isn't designed specifically for operations in that environment. And they allow for some of that in the rules. Chemical agents, nuclear weapons. This is another category that space opera covers quite deeply to some degree that I have never seen in any other science fiction game system. I've seen them touch on the concept of nukes, but it's a given that while either shielding technology or ethics has ruled out that the nukes are a dirty weapon and an archaic weapon by modern futuristic standards, and it's no longer necessary. Then there's the possibility that just the sheer kind of firepower that's available to futuristic navies and militaries, nukes are a wasted material. If you drop a kinetic bomb from orbit, it's going to do as much damage if it's large enough to a city as a nuke, and without as much residue fallout that's going to ruin a planet. Or if you're dealing with atomic-based or antimatter-based weapons, same principle. You're going to use a much more futuristic version of an atomic bomb. Space opera, on the other hand, this is a very strategic weapon because you're not going to use it tactically very often, but you can use it to obliterate planets. And if you put enough of them on the surface, you can make it so the planet's atmosphere is not habitable or conducive for habitation. You can also do a lot of damage cheaply, sadly. So they give us the rules for the operating of that sort of stuff. Like I said, it's almost a page and a half of material just on this subject and the effects of the fallout, how to cope with it, dealing with it, so on and so forth. And then we have another page of the actual weapons themselves in varying degrees, kilotons. Then we got some specialty ones. The Hellburner. It says here the warhead of a Hellburner is a 100 megaton fusion bomb built around a specific modified contragravity unit and very heavily duty force field defensive screen. Upon detonation, the screen generator lasts for a few milliseconds, just enough time for the modified congrav unit to generate an intense field of gravity in the center of the reaction. Heat and pressure of the gravity conditions existing at the core of a star are created See, so they've managed to make them even nastier. Then we get the planet busters, and then we go on to portable rockets and missile launchers, missile guidance systems, break them down by tech levels. The stats for the various known races that use these things, Clappies, they're what they termed Gatling guns. That's pretty much what they're talking about there. Grenade launchers, direct fire weapons, xenon nuclear reaction damping field. This is the reason why nukes were at some point became obsolete, because once the Earth was able to introduce the xenon dampening fields to the planet, it means they could protect enough turf and terrain from generic bombing from a nuclear source to render them pretty much obsolete or pointless. That's not to say that, like I said, there's plenty of when you talk about lower tech level planets, that these things would be lethal on. And then there's environments where we don't care. We're trying to eradicate a world that's swarming with a bug hive. We're going to nuke it to the Stone Age and put enough nukes on the ground that no amount of shielding is going to matter. And yet you still, in doing so in the stories, in the books, in the Star Atlases, there's evidence that various star empires have done that and attempted to do it, and yet the bugs still exist on those planets. They just become mutated and or in less lethal numbers. Anyway, hit location, vehicle combat damage. Like I said, for the most part, this is the only supplement that added to the two core books, which made it kind of a necessary thing to have. I speculate they might have planned on having another weapon and equipment guide that never panned out, but the ones that came in book 2 were sufficient, so they didn't see the need for basically duplicating the stuff that they had. What they didn't have was the depth of the stuff that they have here. This is probably afterthought when they started going out and players started writing it in and going, hey, what is the rules for this? How do we do this? Can we do that? And that's how this came about. May not be that way, but could very well be. It's an interesting read. It's not a lot of material in here, and it's not a lot of it's not really translatable to other game systems, because those game systems have their own set of mechanics. But there are some elements, such as the nukes, for example, that go to quite level of material that you don't find in those other game systems. So having this as a reference material for me was valuable, because every now and then when I get some players that want to dabble in something of that nature, I was able to pull this out and use the conceptual rules to achieve what it was they wanted to achieve. So, good addition. You ever get your hands on it, it's worth dropping $5-10 on it if you can.